I think we all expected that something would happen, but not as dramatic and not as sweeping and not as determined.
To direct the effort, Johnson turned to Sergeant Shriver, the energetic head of the Peace Corps and brother-in-law of the late John Kennedy. When Johnson first offered him the job, Shriver told the president he wasn't interested.
About 2 days later, he called up. It was Saturday morning, and he was talking in a whisper over the telephone. He said, "Sarge, this is your president speaking." I said, "I'm in the cabinet room. We're having a cabinet meeting. But I just wanted to speak to you personally for a few minutes because I want to announce you today on the radio as the new director of the War Against Poverty. So, is that all right with you?" And I said, "Well, Mr. President," I started to whisper myself, you know. I said, "Well, Mr. President," I said, "you know, I really think it would be better." He said, "Well, Sarge, I've got to put the phone down now because we're getting a moment in cabinet. I've got to say something here." So bang, down went the phone. So I turned to my wife and I said, "You know," I said, "I wouldn't be surprised if President Johnson went on the radio here in the next 5 or 10 or 20 minutes and announced me as the head of the War Against Poverty."
Shriver was sworn in on February 18, 1964. Johnson gave him just 6 weeks to come up with a plan.
Mr. Shriver, do you really believe that poverty can be wiped out?
Yes, I do. I disagree with those who feel that grinding poverty, the kind of poverty I mean is the kind of poverty where you have very bad medical care, very bad housing, very bad education. That kind of poverty does not need to exist in the United States any longer. It can be wiped out.
Johnson gave Shriver a mandate. The war on poverty could not include cash handouts. The president did not want to fight poverty with welfare. Shriver immediately convened a task force to begin drafting legislation.
What you do is you call up all the smart people you know, professors and businessmen and experts on communities and so on, and you try to pick their brains. That's what you do. And if you're lucky, as I was, you get a lot of smart people who are willing to volunteer with suggestions and then even to go to work. And that's how we went about developing a war against poverty. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? But in truth, if you've never waged a war, especially against something like poverty, and nobody's around to talk to, there are no graduates like military strategists to tell you what to do, you have to do it by trial and error, and that's what we did.
Shriver would start the conversations by saying, "Now look, what would you do? How would you start a war on poverty? What would you do to get people out of poverty?"
Several task force members supported a government jobs program called for by civil rights and labor leaders, but Johnson refused.
To carry out a program of that scope would have required a tax increase. And the president just rejected it out of hand, and that made the program one approach that you couldn't take.
Just to make work jobs, which had been done in the time of the Depression, seemed to many of us not to be the solution to joblessness. The problem was not jobs, it was people qualified to hold a job. And we had a large population then, the members of which were not competent to hold a job because they were not trained to take on the jobs which were available.
In developing the legislation, the task force focused on expanding opportunity through education and job training programs. They said they were offering the poor a hand up, not a handout.
We had days of discussions about what title we should give our program so that the title itself would immediately define what we're trying to do. We didn't call it welfare program. We didn't call it public assistance program. We call it the economic opportunity program. Those two words, economic opportunity, says it all.
We don't purport in this bill to do everything that needs to be done about poverty for all time in the first year of this program. This is a start in the war against poverty.
In March, Johnson sent Shriver's anti-poverty proposal to Congress. The legislation called for a budget of just under $1 billion, less than 1% of the total federal budget for that year. With presidential elections only 8 months away, Johnson recognized that the success or failure of his anti-poverty legislation could be a referendum on his political future. He campaigned vigorously to make poverty an issue of concern to all Americans.
Johnson, in his early campaigning for the poverty program, went to the hills and valleys of West Virginia and Pennsylvania. They went up those hollows and sat on the front porch with miners and small farmers whose families had been poor for generations, and they were white. The poverty program was, I suppose you could say, just from a political point of view, was a sign that Lyndon Johnson had not forgotten white Americans as well, that he was going to try to move on all fronts to benefit both races.
Our first objective is to free 30 million Americans from the prison of poverty. Can you help us free these Americans from the prison of poverty? And if you can, let me hear your voices.
I mean, it was a very large ambition that he had for that poverty program. It wasn't just simply to reduce the kind of difficulties that people lived in. He was going to end poverty as we know it. That's why it became a war on poverty. He loved the idea of it being big and grand with battle cries. So it fit his need for grandiosity, but it also fit what he cared about in his heart.
He really saw himself as the political leader who could transform the bottom part of America, the poorest part of America. It was part vision, part substantive determination to achieve for the people, and part ego and lust for love. I mean, a desire to be loved and to feel the support of the country for him personally. That he wanted all of it.
The president's task force reported receiving tens of thousands of letters of support.
A lot of people called to say, what can I do to help? That was very, very gratifying. What can I do to help? Then there was another group of people who wanted to work in the program. I'd like to do this, I'd like to do that. County officials, city officials, all wanted to know whether there'd be a role for them. So we knew that this was, in a sense, going to be a winning number, that there was a lot of understanding and sympathy for doing something.
The anti-poverty legislation was advancing through Congress when on August 2nd, Johnson received reports of an alleged attack on U.S. ships off the coast of Vietnam. Johnson called upon Congress to pass the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. That resolution would become the basis for American military involvement in the Vietnam War, a war that would ultimately test Johnson's and the nation's commitment to fighting poverty at home. Less than 3 weeks later, on August 20th, 1964, Johnson signed the Economic Opportunity Act into law, launching his war on poverty. The legislation created programs for early childhood education, Job Corps work training, and college student loans. It also included funds to establish community action agencies, which would give the poor the power to plan and run their own anti-poverty programs. There were no provisions for housing, job creation, or welfare.
They were very conservative programs, if you look at it. The war on poverty was not an attempt to break down the free enterprise system at all. It was an attempt to open that system, to make it possible for everybody to get into that system and benefit from it.
One of the things we did next was to begin to organize people around the different communities in the mountains around the proposal to the Office of Economic Opportunity that was running the war on poverty. And that was a good organizing tool because it got people's minds off the past and trying to recover what they were never going to get back, and to get their minds and faces looking forward to what was possible.
We were going to be able to change the communities and a lot of things in the communities, and a lot of job opportunities, retraining of those people who needed retraining. And so there were a lot of hope.
His community programs of organizing communities and developing community leadership had appealed to me. But I realized that that was limited. So I think I made a comment that if the war on poverty fails, what do we then do? What do we, do we have a revolution? Do we have a civil war? What do we have that will take over if it fails?
In the summer of 1964, America was the wealthiest nation on earth. Johnson had offered a lofty vision of how the nation could use that wealth to become what he called the Great Society.
The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice. It is a place where men are more concerned with the quality of their gold than the quantity of their goods.
Before the year was out, poor Americans would riot in cities across the country, and the first American troops would land in Vietnam. Johnson's war on poverty would be tested in ways he had not imagined.
Next, in America's war on poverty, millions of children are given a head start in school.
I knew that if we could get people when they were young, that we could actually transform their life.
But political conflict could place the entire program in jeopardy.
Whenever the possibility or probability of real change emerged, violence and intimidation would intensify.
Stay tuned for Given a Chance, next in America's War on Poverty.